Welcome to the History Maps podcast. When we look at the source code of a modern computer operating system, we expect perfect logic.
Right, a place for every variable.
Exactly. A rigid hierarchy of commands. If this happens, then that must follow. A system designed to run predictably, filtering out any chaotic inputs to maintain absolute stability.
It functions on strict binary principles. It relies entirely on categorical order to keep the machine from crashing.
But consider what happens when you attempt to apply that kind of rigid binary source code to millions of living, breathing human beings.
That is where it gets complicated.
Yeah, you take a vast population with all its messiness, its ambition, its emotional unpredictability, and you force it into a meticulously coded social software program. Suddenly, that perfect logic collides with reality.
And it produces some incredibly heavy consequences.
Right. So today, we are examining the ultimate collision between philosophical ideals and the muddy, lived reality of human life.
We are doing a deep dive into the society of the Joseon Dynasty in Korea.
Which spans from 1392 to 1897.
And the sources we are unpacking today, detailed academic texts, historical records, architectural analyses, they reveal a machine of immense complexity. While history is frequently taught in terms of singular monarchs and border wars, the actual mechanics of Joseon Korea were entirely found in its social codes.
Completely. The rules of daily life.
Right. So the mission for you, listening to this deep dive, is to unpack how this society functioned on a daily basis. We will explore the vast chasm between the moral ideals it preached and the reality experienced by its people.
From the royal court all the way down to the peasant working the rice paddy.
Exactly. So to understand how this society operated for 5 centuries, we have to look at the ideological operating system they installed right at the beginning.
Right. In 1392, the founders of Joseon adopted Neo-Confucianism. And we should not view this merely as a set of religious beliefs.
It's much broader than that.
It was an all-encompassing framework designed to enforce absolute social stability following the collapse of the previous Goryeo dynasty.
Because the Goryeo period ended in a lot of chaos, right?
Yes, exactly. So the architects of this new era, they based their statecraft on the rationalist school of Zhu Xi, a Chinese philosopher from the Song dynasty.
But Zhu Xi's philosophy is notoriously dense. So if we think about applying this to the daily governance of a nation, how does his specific framework actually function as a tool for control?
Well, it rests on a metaphysical foundation focusing on 2 core concepts.
First, you have Li,
which translates roughly to the universal principle.
Like the underlying perfect pattern of the cosmos.
Yes.
and second, there is Qi, the vital material force that makes up messy physical reality. The entire goal of Neo-Confucianism was to ensure that human society perfectly mirrored the flawless cosmic order of Li.
Right, but the question for the Joseon founders was, how do you achieve perfect cosmic order among millions of unpredictable people?
You give them a strict set of user permissions. You dictate exactly how they're allowed to interact with the system and with each other.
Right, they achieve this through strict moral cultivation, ritual propriety, and most importantly, an ironclad system of hierarchical rules.
Absolutely. Society was strictly governed by what they call the 3 bonds and the 5 relationships.
Let's break those down.
Sure. The 3 bonds mandated the absolute, unquestionable authority of the ruler over the subject, the father over the son, and the husband over the wife.
And then the 5 relationships expanded on that.
Yes, to include the authority of the elder over the junior, and it defined the mutual obligations between friend and friend.
So this reads like a blueprint for every possible human interaction. It leaves no room for ambiguity.
Yeah.
I mean, if you meet someone on the street, you immediately know who holds authority based on age, gender, or status.
Exactly. The early architects of the Joseon state, particularly scholars like Jung Do-jan, utilized this specific philosophy to systematically dismantle Buddhism and shamanism.
Which had held immense power and wealth during the Goryeo era.
Right. Neo-Confucianism was not a weekend religion. It became the legal, political, and economic bedrock of the entire nation. Even the king himself was bound by this code.
Right. The ultimate ideal was the Sangun, a sage ruler.
Yes. His authority did not stem from unchecked divine right, but rather from his personal moral virtue and his strict adherence to the mandate of heaven.
Which implies a technical limitation on his absolute power.
Yeah.
I mean, if his legitimacy is based on Confucian rectitude, then a king who acts without humaneness or righteousness is violating the source code.
He is a malfunctioning component of the state.
Exactly.
And that limitation was very real. Kings were subjected to grueling daily lectures by Confucian scholars who constantly reminded them of their moral obligations.
But the primary goal of the ideology was to lock down the social order.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this contradiction, though. If Neo-Confucianism is fundamentally about moral superiority, humaneness, and achieving a harmonious cosmic order, how did the Joseon founders justify building a society where human beings were permanently locked into unequal, inherited statuses?
It seems contradictory to us today.
Yeah, it sounds like a strict corporate hierarchy where the organizational chart is treated as an unbreakable law of nature.
Well, to modern ears, inequality sounds like a bug in the system. But to the Neo-Confucian scholars of Joseon, hierarchical inequality was the defining feature of cosmic harmony.
Oh, I see.
They genuinely believed that differentiating people based on their social and moral standing was the only effective mechanism to prevent societal chaos.
So they argued that individuals who cultivated moral superiority deserved higher social status.
Yes, and that upholding these strict status distinctions was a moral obligation for every person, regardless of where they sat on the pyramid.
So equality in this framework is actually viewed as a dangerous threat to the natural order. Treating a peasant as equal to a scholar would be as unnatural as treating water like fire.
That ideology perfectly justified the creation of a rigid, caste-like social pyramid that dictated the minutiae of everyday life.
Let's get into the structure of that pyramid. The population was divided into 4 main strata.
Right. At the apex, you had the Yangban, the nobility.
Yeah.
Below them were the Yungin, the middle class, then the Sangmen, the commoners.
And at the foundational bottom, the Chanmen, the outcasts and slaves.
Let's start with the Yangban at the very top. The sources indicate they made up roughly 10% of the population for the majority of the dynasty.
Just 10%. And the term Yangban literally translates to 2 groups, right?
Yes. It originally referred to the civil and military officials who physically stood on the east and west sides of the king during formal court assemblies.
But over time, it evolved.
It evolved to signify the hereditary ruling elite. They completely monopolized government offices. They controlled the vast majority of the wealth, the arable land, and the slave labor.
And the privileges granted to this top 10% were staggering. I mean, they operated entirely outside the burdens placed on the rest of society.
They were completely exempt from paying taxes.
Which is huge.
They were exempt from corvée labor, which was the grueling, unpaid public works system that maintained the nation's infrastructure.
And they were exempt from direct military conscription as foot soldiers. Furthermore, for a long period, they were the only class officially permitted to use surnames.
Right. They were systematically freed from any form of manual labor or financial contribution to the state so that they could dedicate their lives entirely to scholarly pursuits, poetry, and public service.
And this distinction was highly visual, wasn't it?
Very much so. A Yangban man wore garments constructed of imported silks and the finest woven hemp cloth. He wore the distinctive wide-brimmed horsehair hats known as gat.
Right, and lived in expansive multi-courtyard estates. Contrast that visual with the Sangmen, the commoners.
Who made up approximately 80% of the population.
These were the farmers, the artisans, and the merchants.
The Sangmen functioned as the core economic engine of the Joseon state. They bore the absolute brunt of both taxation and forced labor.
Because the farmers cultivated the rice paddies, very frequently operating as tenant farmers working on sprawling estates owned by the Yangban.
And the tax burden was crushing, ranging anywhere from 1/10 to 1/3 of their total harvest.
On top of that, they were mandated by law to provide their physical labor for state projects.
Right, like dike maintenance, road building, and fortress construction.
And unlike the colorful silks of the elite, the Sangmen were restricted by sumptuary laws and economics to dressing almost exclusively in plain, undyed white cotton.
So wedged between this vast commoner class and the elite Yangban was the Yungin, the middle people.
This slice of society essentially acted as the API layer of our operating system metaphor.
That's a good way to put it.
They connected the high-level commands to the actual machinery.
Yes, the Yungin were the technical specialists. A highly educated elite focused on philosophy cannot practically run a country without technical expertise.
So what did they actually do?
They served as interpreters for diplomatic missions to China and Japan. They were the astronomers tracking the calendar, the physicians managing public health.
Cartographers mapping the borders, local clerks managing taxation on the ground.
Exactly. They possessed practical, specialized skills that were absolutely essential for the state machinery to function.
Yet, despite their vital roles in their education, they were strictly barred from the highest levels of government.
Because those policymaking positions were fiercely guarded by the Yangban.
Right, and this Yonan class also became a repository for a very specific, marginalized group of people, the seal.
Yes, the Seol. These were the illegitimate children born to Yangban men and their commoner or slave concubines.
Because the Neo-Confucian ideology placed a relentless emphasis on the purity of the patrilineal bloodline, the mother's social status legally tainted the child.
Right. So if a high-ranking state minister had a child with a low-born concubine, that child was a Seol.
Despite sharing the exact same father as a legitimate Yangban heir, the seal were legally downgraded.
They were barred from taking the higher civil service examinations, effectively preventing them from holding significant office, and they were denied the economic and social rights of a true Yangban.
If we look closely at this seal restriction, the ideology starts to look like a convenient cover story.
How so?
Well, you have a society obsessed with preserving and passing down noble bloodlines. Yet, when a nobleman actually produces a child, that child is legally downgraded and pushed into a lower class.
Right, because of the mother.
It seems entirely counterintuitive to the idea of celebrating a superior bloodline. It looks less like cosmic harmony and more like a calculated mechanism for resource hoarding.
The sources strongly support that interpretation. The rigid system functioned as a brilliant strategy for the elite to consolidate resources.
Because the privileges of the Yangban class, the massive tax exemptions, the vast land grants, the right to own slaves, were incredibly expensive for the state to maintain.
Exactly. If every single child of every Yangban man, including the dozens of children some men had with multiple concubines, were granted full, legitimate Yangban status, the elite class would have exploded in size within a few generations.
The economic pie would be sliced into thousands of tiny, worthless pieces.
And the state would go bankrupt trying to subsidize a massive, non-tax-paying aristocracy.
So by maintaining this legal fiction that the mother's blood tainted the noble father's blood, they kept the Yangban pool artificially small and exclusive.
Yes. By pushing their own illegitimate children into the Yungan class, the legitimate heirs protected their monopoly on land, inherited wealth, and government power.
The moral purity argument was a highly effective rhetorical tool masking a harsh economic reality.
Very much so. Which brings us to the foundational layer of this societal architecture, the people bearing the weight of the entire structure, the Qianmen.
The base people.
The Qianmen were categorized into two broad groups,
Right.
the outcasts and the slaves.
Let's talk about the outcasts first.
Yeah. They included specialized groups like the Baekjeong, who were essentially the untouchables of Joseon society.
These were individuals whose professions violated strict Buddhist traditions against taking life, or Confucian purity norms.
Right, they were the butchers, the leather workers, the basket weavers, and the executioners.
And the isolation of the Baekjeong was absolute. They were not merely poor, they were treated as ritually unclean.
They were physically segregated, forced to live in specific settlements on the fringes of towns or in barren mountainous areas.
They faced intense daily discrimination, right?
Yes. They were forbidden to wear silk, to wear the traditional horsehair hats, or even to use proper titles of respect when speaking to each other.
A member of the upper class would go out of their way to avoid walking on the same side of the street as a Baekjeong.
And they were denied any form of formal education and were completely barred from the examination system.
And the other major group trapped within the Qianmin class were the nobi, the hereditary slaves. When we read the sources detailing the scale of the nobi system, the numbers are really hard to comprehend.
Slavery was not a marginal practice. It was deeply institutionalized.
Right. At its peak, during the 15th to 17th centuries, historical records estimate that slaves comprised 30 to 40% of the entire population of the Joseon state.
30 to 40%.
Think about that ratio. Nearly 4 out of every 10 people you passed in the street or saw working in a field were legally classified as property.
The nobis were divided into public slaves, who were owned by the government and worked in state ministries or military garrisons, and private slaves who were owned by individual young-born families.
And private slaves could be bought, sold, traded, gifted, or inherited, exactly like livestock or tracts of real estate.
Furthermore, the status was permanently hereditary. The legal code dictated that if a mother was a slave, her children were born as slaves, regardless of the father's status.
The hypocrisy is glaring. We just discussed how the Yangban justified their elite status through their supposed mastery of Neo-Confucian morality.
Right.
They spend their days writing poetry about Ren, which is humanness, and Yi, righteousness.
They debate the fine points of cosmic justice. Yet, their entire lifestyle of scholarly leisure, their ability to sit and read philosophy all day, is entirely subsidized by owning human beings who are forced to harvest their rice, chop their wood, and weave their clothes.
It is the most profound contradiction in the Joseon operating system. Some Neo-Confucian scholars attempted mental gymnastics to justify it.
How could they possibly justify that?
They argued that slavery was a necessary penal deterrent for immoral behavior, or they tried to frame the master-slave relationship as a natural, paternalistic extension of the ruler-subject dynamic outlined in the three bonds.
But the reality recorded in the texts was far from benevolent paternalism.
Not at all. Slave labor underpinned the entire agrarian economy.
And if Inobe attempted to escape this system, the state authorized professional slave hunters to track down the runaways.
Upon capture, they faced brutal, legally sanctioned corporal punishment, including branding or severe beatings.
So if a society is built on a pyramid where 30% of people are slaves and only 10% hold all the wealth and power, the obvious question for anyone living in that society is, how do I get to the top?
Or if I'm already at the top, how do I prove I deserve to stay?
Right. The state's official mechanism for this was the Guagio, the civil service examination system.
Passing the Guajir was the primary legal avenue to achieve or maintain Yangban status and secure a government post.
On paper, the Guagio appears to be a firewall designed around pure meritocracy. It was ostensibly established to bypass inherited feudal power.
And instead recruit the most brilliant, morally upright minds into the central bureaucracy.
Because the exams rigorously tested a candidate's mastery of the 4 books and 5 classics of Neo-Confucianism, their ability to compose complex essays on state policy, and their knowledge of historical precedents.
It sounds like the ultimate equalizer. You study the source code harder than anyone else, you pass the test, and you earn the right to run the country.
The legal statutes actually stated that the preliminary exams were open to all freeborn males, which technically included the massive Sangmin commoner class.
But the lived reality was an entirely different story. Let's look at the statistics. Over the 500 years of the Joseon Dynasty, only about 15,150 individuals passed the highest level of the literary exam, the Mengwa.
Wait, over 500 years?
Yes. During the regular triennial examination cycles, the state selected exactly 33 candidates from across the entire nation.
33 candidates. Every 3 years. In a country of millions, the bottleneck is microscopic.
And the data on the successful candidates is even more revealing. The average age of passing the highest exam was 34.
That single data point completely destroys the illusion of meritocracy. If the average successful candidate is 34 years old, it tells you exactly who is permitted to take this test. Preparing for the Guagio was not something you did in the evenings after a day of work. It required decades of intense, singular focus.
Yes. You had to master classical Chinese, which was completely different from the spoken Korean language.
You had to memorize thousands of pages of dense philosophical texts. You had to perfect the physical art of calligraphy.
To achieve that level of mastery by age 34, a candidate needed absolute leisure time. They required private tutors, expensive ink, and imported paper.
And a family wealthy enough to feed and house an adult male who contributed 0 physical labor or income to the household for 2 decades.
Exactly. This economic reality effectively served as an invisible barrier barring the Sangmen.
The 80% of the population who had to break their backs in the fields just to survive the winter could never realistically compete.
So it functions exactly like an inherited country club membership, disguised as a rigorous academic meritocracy.
Right. The exam legitimizes the Yangban's hold on power by making it appear as though they earned it through intellectual superiority. But the entire system was carefully engineered so that only the extremely wealthy aristocracy possessed the necessary resources to even enter the race.
And the preparation for these grueling exams increasingly shifted away from the capital and into private rural academies known as Seowon.
Ah, the Seowon. The rise of these academies completely altered the political landscape of Joseon. The first of these academies was established around 1543, correct?
Yes, Seowon was the first, founded to honor deceased local scholars and to provide a secluded environment for the advanced study of the Confucian classics.
So initially they functioned as intended, quiet places for moral cultivation and academic rigor.
However, because these Seowon began producing the successful candidates who passed the Gwagyo and entered the government bureaucracy, they quickly transformed into immense centers of political power.
They mutated from study halls into political action committees.
Precisely. They forged deep links between scholars across different provinces, creating shared intellectual lineages.
So a student's loyalty to their specific Saiwan and their master often superseded their loyalty to the state.
Yes. By the late 16th century, these intricate scholarly networks fueled a state of extreme, volatile factionalism at court, known as Dangpa.
And the Yangban elite became consumed with debating incredibly minute interpretive nuances of Neo-Confucian philosophy.
They would wage political warfare over esoteric concepts like the 4-7 thesis, a debate regarding the origins of human emotion and principle.
And they used these philosophical differences as weapons to purge rival factions from government posts and secure lucrative positions for their own academy brethren.
This factional strife severely paralyzed the daily governance of the state.
And when a state's operating system is completely tied up running background arguments over philosophy, it becomes incredibly vulnerable to external inputs.
We see this play out with devastating consequences during the Imjin War in 1592.
Right. The Japanese invasion under Toyotomi Hideyoshi exposed the fatal flaws in the Joseon military and bureaucratic systems.
Because the Gwagyo system fundamentally prioritized the rote memorization of ancient literature and moral philosophy over practical governance, logistics, or military strategy.
The elite looked down on military officers. So when a massive, battle-hardened Japanese force armed with advanced muskets landed on the shores of Busan, the Joseon response was led by scholars whose primary qualification for leadership was their ability to write elegant poetry about cosmic harmony.
Furthermore, the Dangpa factionalism at the royal court was so deeply entrenched that the ministers could not even agree on the reality of the threat or how to coordinate a defense.
Leading to catastrophic early losses and the devastation of the peninsula.
It is a terrifying historical lesson. A system designed exclusively to maintain internal stability and prevent social mobility becomes completely brittle when subjected to a sudden, violent external shock.
It lacked the flexibility to adapt.
The state eventually recognized the existential danger posed by these academies. Much later, in 1868, the powerful regent Hongsin Daewongun issued a sweeping decree that abolished almost all the Seowon in the country.
Because he viewed them as corrupt centers of factional strife that were actively draining the state's resources through their extensive tax exemptions and hidden land holdings.
Right. But the Yangban obsession with maintaining their elite status and enforcing strict order was not confined to the halls of government or the examination cells.
No, it dictated the literal architecture of their homes and the physical structure of their families.
Let's walk through the physical space they inhabited, the hanok, or traditional Korean house. We see the social hierarchy built into the very foundations.
The architectural design of the hanok is a brilliant adaptation to the extreme Korean climate, but it also functioned as a massive billboard broadcasting the owner's social status.
A standard hanok featured two primary engineering marvels. For the bitter, freezing winters, they developed the ondol,
which was a highly sophisticated underfloor heating system.
The heat and smoke from a wood fire built in the kitchen furnace were drawn through horizontal masonry flues beneath the floors of the living quarters, radiating heat upward before exiting through a chimney.
And to survive the sweltering, humid summers, the houses featured the maru. These were airy, elevated wooden floors, often open to courtyards, designed to catch breezes and circulate air throughout the structure.
Both a peasant and a nobleman might utilize variations of ondol and maru, but the materials used instantly classified the inhabitants.
Right. The wealthy Yangban constructed expansive, multi-courtyard compounds utilizing massive timber pillars, polished stone bases, and sweeping, elegant tiled roofs, known as giwa.
The Sangmin commoners lived in significantly smaller, humbler dwellings constructed of mud walls and topped with woven straw-thatched roofs, known as choga.
The law actually regulated the size and ornamentation of houses based on social rank, so your physical house proved your wealth. But in Joseon society, wealth alone did not equal status.
You could be a rich merchant, but you were still a commoner.
Right. Status was derived from exactly who your ancestors were. It was entirely about lineage.
Lineage was the ultimate currency. The entire society was organized around the concept of bongwan, which translates to the ancestral seat of origin.
It tracked the specific geographic location where a surname lineage originated.
To legitimately claim you were a Yangban, you could not simply show up wearing silk. You had to produce your jokbo, your family's meticulously maintained printed genealogy chart.
So imagine if, to get a promotion at your job today or to avoid paying your taxes, you had to produce a massive book proving that your great-great-grandfather was a high-ranking government official and definitively proving that no one in your entire family tree had ever been a butcher or a slave.
That is the level of intense ancestral surveillance we were talking about with the jokbo.
It was a vital legal document, essentially a passport to privilege.
Interestingly, only male family members were recorded in detail, as the ideology dictated that only men prolonged the lineage.
Your jokbo proved the purity of your bloodline. That proof was required to register for the civil service exams, to claim your exemptions from military service and taxation, and to arrange marriages with other elite families.
It was so critical to one's survival and prosperity that by the late Joseon period, as the economy shifted and some commoner merchants amassed great wealth, a massive black market emerged.
Oh, really?
Yes, merchants would pay exorbitant sums for forged jokbo records, buying their way into impoverished Yangbun families to escape the stigma and financial burdens of their lower-class status.
But simply possessing the book was not enough. Maintaining the legitimate status required the rigorous performance of the jesa, the ancestral rites.
This wasn't a private, emotional remembrance of a lost loved one. It was a highly formalized public requirement.
The jesa formed the absolute ritual core of clan cohesion.
According to Neo-Confucian belief, when a person died, their qi dispersed, but their li remained.
The jesa ceremonies were conducted to express filial piety, to provide spiritual sustenance to deceased ancestors, and to secure their continued blessings for the living family.
And the rituals were incredibly precise.
They involve setting up wooden ancestral tablets, preparing and offering highly specific foods, raw meat, cooked rice, specific fruits placed in a mandated geographic orientation on the table, and performing a synchronized sequence of ritual bows and wine offerings.
These ceremonies were conducted on the anniversaries of death, on major holidays like Chuseok, and they could last for hours. It was an exhausting display of filial devotion.
Critically, under the strict Neo-Confucian rules adopted by the Joseon state, the jesa had to be led and financed entirely by the eldest male heir of the primary wife.
This specific religious and ritual requirement became the catalyst that completely rewired the economic and legal systems of the country.
Because the eldest son bore the immense financial and spiritual burden of performing the ancestral rites for all preceding generations, the laws regarding inheritance underwent a massive shift.
If we look at the source documents from the early dynasty, the laws regarding inheritance look surprisingly different. Property was largely divided equally among all children, sons and daughters alike.
That equal division was a cultural holdover from the preceding Goryeo period. But as Neo-Confucianism tightened its grip on society during the mid to late Joseon era, the legal framework shifted heavily toward primogeniture.
To ensure the eldest son had the resources necessary to maintain the ancestral shrine and host the expensive jesa banquets, he began to inherit the vast bulk of the estate, the main house, the most productive land, and the majority of the slaves.
Younger sons received drastically smaller fractions of the wealth to establish branch families, and daughters eventually lost their inheritance rights entirely, receiving only a dowry when they were married off into another clan.
Think about the psychological weight placed on the eldest son in this system. It is like being born as the CEO of a massive corporation, where the board of directors consists entirely of your deceased ancestors.
If you fail to perform the jizya perfectly, or if you squander the inherited wealth needed to fund it, you don't just lose your money.
You bankrupt your family's cosmic standing and social legitimacy for generations to come.
The pressure was absolute. But while the eldest son bore the burden of performance, the architectural and familial restructuring caused by these rites had the most profound, restrictive, and devastating impact on the lives of half the population, the women of Joseon.
So, if the eldest son is inheriting the entire estate simply to pay for these elaborate ancestor rituals, what happens to the daughters?
They don't just lose their share of the money, they literally lose their place in the physical house and their autonomy within society.
The rules governing women's lives were defined by a doctrine known as the Samjongjido, the Three Obediences.
The three obediences dictated a woman's entire life cycle through submission. A woman was legally and morally required to obey her father before marriage, to obey her husband during marriage, and, if she outlived her husband, to obey her eldest son.
She had no independent legal standing outside of her relationship to a male guardian.
This philosophical subjugation was enforced through strict physical segregation. Women's roles were entirely confined to the ne, the inner quarters of the home, while men handled the o, the outer affairs of business, politics, and scholarship.
The spatial division was legally mandated by the Nawabop, the inner-outer law.
The Nawabop dictated the actual blueprints of Joseon homes. A Yangban compound was physically divided. The Anche was the women's domain.
It was always located deep inside the compound, shielded from the main entrance, functioning almost like a fortress within a fortress.
The Sarangche was the men's quarters, positioned near the front gate where the master of the house could study and host male guests.
And the architecture was intentionally designed to block any visibility between the inner and outer quarters. Male guests were strictly forbidden from entering the anche, and the women within were expected to remain unseen and unheard by the outside world.
The psychological isolation of living your entire life confined to the inner courtyards of a house is hard to grasp today.
And the Nawabop extended far beyond the walls of the Hanak. It dictated that women of high social class were virtually erased from public space.
If a Yangban woman absolutely had to leave the house during daylight hours, she was required to travel in a completely enclosed palanquin.
If she walked, she had to wear a heavy, suffocating veil like the shango, which resembled a full-length coat worn over the head, covering her completely and exposing only her eyes to the street.
Even commoner women were subjected to these modesty laws, mandated to wear a simpler shawl called a tsushima over their heads.
However, the strict enforcement of the Nawabop highlights a recurring theme. Pure Confucian ideals were a luxury that only the elite could afford to practice.
Right. For a peasant woman in the Sangmin class, total segregation and covering up was impossible. She had to work knee-deep in the rice paddies alongside the men, draw water from the village well, and sell goods in the market just to ensure her family didn't starve.
The ideology demanded female invisibility, but economic reality demanded their labor.
The systematic dismantling of women's rights is most visible in the drastic shift in marriage customs. If we compare the early Joseon period to the later centuries, it is a completely different world.
During the Goryeo dynasty, and lingering into the early Joseon years, they practiced a custom called namguikotan.
Under this system, the groom actually moved into the bride's family home or built a house on her family's property for an extended period after the wedding, sometimes until their children were fully grown.
That specific living arrangement granted women significant leverage. Because they remained surrounded by their birth family and their own inherited resources, they retained a powerful voice in the household dynamics.
However, the Neo-Confucian state viewed this as fundamentally unnatural. They aggressively pushed to replace it with chinyung, a system where the bride was required to immediately move into the groom's household on the day of the wedding.
The source is, quote, a specific, very harsh phrase used to describe a married daughter under this new system, cholga oen, which translates to one who left the family and became an outsider.
That phrase perfectly encapsulates the legal and emotional severing of the bride from her past.
Once a woman was classified as an outsider to her birth family, the justification for granting her a share of the inheritance completely vanished.
In fact, families began to view daughters as economic liabilities, referred to colloquially as thieves of the family wealth, because of the exorbitant dowries required to marry them off into suitable Yangban clans.
By disinheriting their daughters and concentrating all wealth in the eldest son, the elite families ensured their massive landholdings remained intact over generations, preserving the economic dominance of the patrilineage.
And once a woman was relocated to her husband's home, her singular overriding duty was to produce a male heir to continue his family line and perform his family's jessa.
If she failed in this biological task, the consequences were devastating. Failure to produce a son was listed as the primary offense among the Chulgyojiak, the 7 sins that legally justified a husband divorcing his wife.
The list of the 7 sins is a stark illustration of the power imbalance. A man could unilaterally divorce his wife for disobedience to his parents, the inability to bear a son, adultery, jealousy, possessing a genetic or incurable disease, talkativeness, and kleptomania.
Notice that this legal mechanism was entirely one-sided. A woman had virtually no legal recourse to initiate a divorce against her husband, even in cases of severe physical abuse or neglect.
A man could take as many concubines as his wealth allowed, yet a wife could be divorced simply for exhibiting jealousy over those concubines.
The standard of chastity and fidelity applied to women was absolute and unforgiving.
And that standard did not end with the husband's death. In fact, it became even more extreme. The remarriage of widows, particularly among the Yangben class, was strictly prohibited by law from the late 15th century onward.
If a young widow chose to remarry to support herself, the state retaliated brutally. Her children from the new marriage were permanently cast out of the noble class and barred from taking the civil service exams.
The psychological terror of this system is captured in the physical objects women were expected to carry. The sources describe how the cultural pressure to uphold this extreme chastity was so overwhelming that some elite women carried small ornamental knives called peido attached to their traditional clothing by a silk cord.
The peido was not a tool. It was a daily, physical reminder of the ultimate expectation.
Women were culturally conditioned to believe that taking their own lives with the peido was the only acceptable response if they were subjected to assault or even faced the mere rumor of dishonor.
The preservation of the family's pure reputation was vastly more important than the woman's life. I mean, waking up every morning and tying the instrument of your own death to your clothing, fully aware that society expects you to use it rather than bring shame to your father or your husband.
It is a dark testament to how deeply the operating system had colonized the minds of its subjects, and the state actively reinforced this dark reality through a system of public rewards.
They erected red wooden gates, called Hong Salman, in front of the homes of virtuous women, widows who remained chaste their entire lives, or women who committed suicide to protect their honor.
These state honors elevated the entire family's social and political standing. It created a perverse incentive system where families would actively enforce these draconian rules on their own daughters, sometimes pushing them towards suicide, to secure political favor for the male relatives.
Yet, human societies are incredibly resilient. Even within a system designed with such suffocating, airtight logic, glitches appear.
When we examine the historical record closely, we find striking exceptions where the operating system had to patch itself to prevent a total crash.
We find spaces where women, against all odds, wielded profound influence. We see this at the very highest level with the Queen Dowagers.
The Neo-Confucian system was designed to entirely exclude women from political power. However, it also placed a massive conflicting emphasis on the concept of filial piety and generational seniority within the royal family.
This created a powerful legal loophole. When a reigning king died and his appointed heir was too young to rule, the most senior female member of the royal family, the Queen Dowager, was legally permitted to step in as regent.
This was known as Suryam Cheongjong, or ruling from behind the bamboo screen.
The most famous early example of this workaround is Queen Zhonghui. In 1468 and again in 1469, she wielded influence. But it was in 1476, acting for her young grandson, King Seongjong, that she solidified her power.
Queen Zhonghui became Joseon's first official queen regent. Because of her absolute seniority in the palace hierarchy, no male minister could legally overrule her commands.
She sat behind a screen in the throne room, issuing royal edicts, appointing top officials, managing state finances, and essentially running the entire country.
Centuries later, in the 19th century, Queen Sinjong utilized the exact same loophole to dominate court politics, leveraging her position to place King Gojong on the throne and dictate state policy alongside his father.
It is a breathtaking paradox. The exact same bureaucratic machinery that forces a woman to wear a suffocating veil just to walk down the street and legally defines her as an outsider to her own family is standing at attention, taking direct orders from a female regent behind a screen.
It demonstrates that the Joseon state, for all its rigid philosophical posturing, was fundamentally pragmatic. They were willing to temporarily suspend their core gender ideology when it served the ultimate need of the state, preserving dynastic continuity.
They preferred a female ruler to a chaotic succession crisis.
We see another fascinating exception, another patch in the system, with the creation of the Unyo, the female physicians.
The Unyo emerged as a direct response to a crisis caused by their own rules. The Niwabop laws of strict separation meant that male doctors were legally forbidden from closely examining, touching, or treating female patients, especially the women of the royal court and the Yangban nobility.
Male doctors had to diagnose illnesses by feeling a woman's pulse through a silk thread tied to her wrist from another room.
As a result, elite women were suffering and dying from treatable illnesses because they could not receive proper medical care without violating modesty laws.
The system was literally killing the wives and daughters of the men who created it. You cannot maintain a dynasty if the women who are supposed to birth the heirs are dying from lack of health care.
Recognizing this fatal flaw, the government established medical institutions, such as the Haimenguk, to actively train women as medical professionals.
But they could not use Yangbon women, as that would violate their seclusion. Instead, they recruited young girls from the lowest tier of society, the Cheonmin class, often the daughters of government-owned slaves.
Because the low-born slave girls were not considered morally significant enough to be bound by the strict modesty rules of the elite.
Exactly. These low-born girls were brought to the capital and subjected to intense medical education. They were taught to read complex classical Chinese medical texts.
They studied anatomy, acupuncture, pulse diagnosis, and obstetrics.
They faced rigorous monthly examinations. If they excelled, they were rewarded with government stipends and elevated status within their institutions. If they failed, they were harshly punished and returned to menial slave labor.
As a result of this intense crucible, the Uinyo acquired highly specialized advanced medical knowledge that often surpassed their male counterparts.
So you have a situation where the most advanced life-saving medical procedures in the kingdom are being performed by women who are legally classified as property.
They are elite professionals operating at the very bottom of the social caste. But the most glaring, spectacular contradiction in the entire Joseon system has to be the Kisang.
The Kiseng were female entertainers, continuing a tradition that had existed since the Goryeo dynasty. Officially, under the law, they were classified as Cheonmin.
They were state-owned slaves belonging to local government offices or military garrisons, and their status was permanently hereditary.
But their daily reality, their lived experience, was absolutely nothing like the laborers working the fields.
Not at all. The Gisang were subjected to a rigorous elite education from a very young age.
They were trained extensively in classical poetry, calligraphy, painting, instrumental music like the Gayagium, and traditional dance.
Their primary state function was to entertain foreign diplomats, particularly envoys from Ming and Qing China, and to serve at state banquets for the Yangbon scholar officials.
Because of this specific role, they were the absolute only women in Joseon society who were legally permitted to mingle freely with men in public spaces.
This is a massive system-breaking paradox. You have the Qizheng sitting in pavilions, reciting complex classical Chinese poetry, debating philosophy, and engaging in high-level intellectual banter with the top government ministers of the nation.
They are essentially acting as the intellectual equals of the Yangbanren.
Yet, on the official census, they are classified at the exact same level as a butcher or a runaway slave. It completely short-circuits the Neo-Confucian logic that status is a reflection of moral and intellectual superiority.
It completely exposes the hypocrisy of the ruling class. The Qisang, such as the legendary Huang Jinyu from the 16th century, were celebrated across the nation for their exceptional wit, their stunning beauty, and their artistic brilliance.
Huan Jinyi's Sizhou poems are still considered some of the most beautiful literature of the era. Elite scholars would travel for miles just to converse with her.
Yet, despite her fame and intellectual dominance, she completely lacked autonomy over her own physical labor. The government controlled their assignments.
They were required to perform at official ceremonies, and the dark reality is that they were also frequently forced into sexual obligations with government officials.
And despite their elite education, they could never legally marry a Yangban man and become a primary wife. They could only ever hope to become a concubine, meaning any children they bore would be permanently branded with the Seol status, locked out of power.
The existence of the dowagers, the Uinyo, and the Kiseng perfectly illustrates the limits of the ideology.
The Joseon state was fanatically committed to its rigid social and gender hierarchies, but it was perfectly willing to hack its own system when it served the pragmatic desires of the elite men in charge.
They needed dynastic stability, so they permitted female regents.
They needed their wives to survive childbirth without breaking modesty laws, so they educated slave women as doctors.
They deeply desired the intellectual stimulation, romance, and artistic companionship that their cloistered, secluded wives were legally forbidden to provide, so they institutionalized a class of highly educated, enslaved entertainers.
It is a society defined by absolute, unbending rules and equally absolute, highly convenient workarounds.
The society of the Joseon dynasty was a meticulously constructed, highly controlled machine. It took the source code of Neo-Confucianism and used it to engineer every single aspect of human life, from the architecture of the floors to the mourning rituals for the dead.
And historically speaking, we must acknowledge that the machine achieved its primary goal. It produced 5 centuries of relative internal stability.
It created a highly coherent, literate culture, it preserved incredibly detailed historical records, and it built a state infrastructure that managed to survive massive external invasions from both Japan and the Manchu.
But the human cost of that stability was nearly unfathomable.
That piece was paid for by the 80% of Sangam farmers groaning under crushing taxes and forced labor.
It was paid for by the 30 to 40% of the population locked into hereditary slavery, treated as livestock.
It was paid for by the women who were systematically stripped of their property, confined to the inner quarters of their homes, and forced to carry knives to ensure they met impossible standards of chastity.
The system achieved order by entirely stifling social mobility, crushing innovation, and punishing equality, all to protect the inherited privileges of the top 10%.
The history of Joseon forces us to ask a difficult question. What are we willing to sacrifice for the sake of absolute order? The Yangban elite successfully convinced an entire civilization for 500 years that their highly artificial, deeply unequal hierarchy was the natural, unchangeable law of the universe.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over as we conclude.
Consider how deeply ingrained historical systems of status, lineage, and access can echo into our modern day. If the architects of the Joseon dynasty could engineer a society where extreme inequality and slavery were viewed as the natural law of the cosmos for 5 centuries, what invisible natural laws of social hierarchy might we be blindly accepting in our own modern societies right now?
What parts of our current social source code, in our economies, our education systems, our workplaces, are we assuming are just the natural order of things, when they might actually be meticulously designed to keep someone else safely at the top?
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.